42 European leaders, including European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, scurried to Budapest, Hungary, for a summit that was largely dictated by the results of the United States presidential election. The meeting primarily focused on potential US tariffs on European exports, their potential impact on European economies, unregulated and illegal migration, and the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. The meeting's clear message was to support Ukraine in its war against Russia, but it did not provide any specific actions. Instead, it conveyed a moral message about the collective European concern over the events across the Atlantic. Europeans are concerned about potential changes in US support for Ukraine. Given that the topic of ending foreign wars is a contentious election issue that could potentially impact Ukraine's aid structure. However, Europeans are more concerned about a potential decrease in US support for NATO, given Russia's perceived threat to Europe, than the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. The European leaders are assessing their security situation with reduced US involvement. Sensationalist media on both sides of the Atlantic hype the headline concern in Europe, which is that the US may leave NATO or fail to fulfill its Article 5 commitments. Statements from the previous President Trump administration and his campaign, which stipulate that NATO countries must meet their defense commitments at a minimum of 2% of GDP, largely fuel this concern. In 2014, the Russian seizure of Crimea prompted NATO to set a GDP target, which largely went unmet, with only the United States, the United Kingdom and Poland meeting it. The new Secretary-General of NATO, Mark Rutte, admitted that President Trump was right to press the European nations to meet their agreed-upon targets in 2017. The 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine finally stirred NATO countries to act on defense spending and have since doubled their defense budgets 2 years after the invasion. However, despite this, only 22 of 32 NATO nations are meeting their commitments. The European leaders anticipate pressure from the incoming administration to fulfill the 2014 agreement. The European Union, despite its incomplete integration, stands as the world's largest GDP bloc, making it challenging to argue against its ability to meet its economic defense obligations. European leaders, led by the French, want to be more active in European defense policy and seem to indicate they want Europe not to be dependent on the US for its security. French President Macron's statements suggest that Europe should rely on its own defense capabilities, and it seems that he would prefer France to step in if the US were to leave Europe. Macron is no Charles de Gaulle, but tries to act like one since late 2023. President Macron accurately asserts that the US is overburdened with commitments in the Middle East due to conflicts between Israel and Iran, as well as in the Western Pacific due to an increasingly assertive China, and that Europe must take on more responsibility. President Macron has a valid point, and though he comes from a position of French self-interest, he is correct. This does not imply that President Trump will withdraw from NATO, but rather that he is adopting a negotiating stance to persuade the Europeans to at least meet the 2014 commitment. If the support for the Ukraine war requires increased defense spending, it should exceed the 2% GDP target. The German-based IFO Institute has also provided an analysis that appears to back up President Trump's point. The institute had a press release on the day of the summit stating that due to decades of neglect, most NATO countries, including Canada, need to drastically increase defense spending to make up for the neglect. Poland, the US and the United Kingdom were largely considered to have met their commitments. While the US faced challenges due to its global commitments, most other nations did not. Higher levels of defense spending are required compared to what other NATO countries are expected to meet. The Institute provided a report on the extent of the issue to redress security needs if Europe wants to be largely independent of US security. Below is a list of the top 3 countries with the highest defense spending deficits. So Germany, $248 billion, 230 billion euros. Italy, $130 billion, 120 billion euros. Spain, $86 billion, 80 billion euros. Meeting the 2% GDP target won't make up for this deficit. And if a portion of defense budgets go to support Ukraine in its war, they must be increased beyond the minimum target. The other issue lies in the lack of defense capacity to produce the necessary materials to bridge this gap. The laws of supply and demand dictate that the above figures will continue to rise due to the rapid demand for defense spending. This cost increase will persist until Europe addresses the supply side of the issue, either through increased production capacity or by procuring goods from countries outside of Europe, such as the US, Japan and South Korea. Europe has found itself in a difficult situation. Despite their disapproval of the president-elect's harsh statements, it is evident that most NATO countries in Europe and Canada have a long way to go before they can assert a firm, rational, and defensible stance on their defense commitments when confronted with the United States on this issue. The issue does not lie in the US leaving NATO, but rather in NATO's need to assume greater responsibility, including compensating for decades of neglect. NATO countries can anticipate pressure, persuasion, and potential public criticism to increase their defense spending commitments. Europe's nations must make difficult budget and geopolitical decisions to reach this commitment, and next steps if they choose not to meet it.